The Galactic Council had existed for 40,000 years before humans ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. In that time, the Council had grown to include 312 species from across the galaxy. They had built stations that could house millions. They had created faster-than-light travel. They had mapped 97% of the known galaxy, but they had never solved the problem of data collection. It was not that the Council species were stupid. Far from it. They had developed quantum computing when humans were still living in caves. They had built artificial intelligences that could process more information in a second than most species could in a lifetime. They had created biological computers that grew and evolved on their own. Each species had contributed something remarkable to the collective knowledge of the galaxy. But data collection remained a nightmare. Every species had its own way of recording information. They used crystalline matrices that could store incredible amounts of data, but required specialized equipment to read. They preferred neural networks that were efficient but incompatible with most other systems. They used organic memory cells that degraded over time and could not be easily. There were 312 species, and there were 312 different ways of collecting, storing, and organizing information. The result was chaos. A simple query about a planet's atmospheric composition might require accessing 40 different databases, each with its own format, its own language, and its own retrieval system. Researchers spent more time trying to find information than actually using it. Important discoveries were lost because no one knew where they had been stored. Duplicate research was conducted constantly because scientists could not determine what had already been done. The Council had tried to solve this problem many times. Committees were formed. Standards were proposed, but nothing ever worked. Each species believed its own method was superior. Each species refused to abandon its traditions. The data problem was considered unsolvable, a permanent feature of galactic civilization that everyone simply had to accept. Then the humans arrived. Ambassador Sarah stepped off her shuttle onto Station Prime with it in her hand and a frown on her face. Earth had made first contact with the Council only 5 years ago. Humans were still the species in the galactic community. They were still considered primitive, backward, barely worth noticing. Their technology was centuries behind the most advanced Council species. Their civilization was young. Their achievements were modest. But Sarah had noticed something that none of the Council species seemed to see. Despite their incredible technology, despite their thousands of years of experience, the Council was drowning in its own information. She had spent 3 months trying to access basic historical records about human-related matters. The information existed somewhere in the Council's vast databases, but finding it was nearly impossible. She requested a meeting with the Council of Science. It took 6 weeks to arrange. When she finally stood before the assembled representatives of the galaxy's greatest scientific minds, they looked at her with polite disinterest. What could a human possibly have to say that would interest them? Sarah began by asking a simple question. How long would it take to find all research conducted on silicon-based life forms in the past 1,000 years? The representative said it would take approximately 6 months. The representative estimated 8 months. The representative admitted it might be impossible, as many of their older records had degraded beyond recovery. Sarah nodded and then made her proposal. She wanted to create a unified data collection system, not a system that would replace each species' individual methods, but a system that would connect them all. A universal standard that every database could communicate through. A common language for information. The Council representatives were skeptical. Many had tried this before, all had failed. But Sarah had something that previous attempts had lacked. She had humans. Humans were strange creatures by galactic standards. Their bodies were unremarkable, their senses were limited, they were short, but their minds worked differently than any other species in the galaxy. Humans had evolved on a planet filled with diverse environments and competing species. They had developed an incredible ability to categorize, organize, and systematize information. It was how they had survived. It was how they had thrived. More importantly, humans had already solved this exact problem on their own world. Earth had thousands of languages, thousands of cultures, thousands of different ways of recording information. Yet humans had created systems that allowed all of them to communicate. They had developed libraries, databases, search engines, and organizational standards that could handle incredible diversity. They had practice that no other species had ever needed. Sarah brought in a team of human researchers. They were librarians, database architects, information scientists, and systems analysts. They were people who had spent their careers organizing and categorizing information. They were experts in a field that most galactic species did not even know existed. Dr. Michael Tors led the team. He was a quiet man with gray hair and kind eyes. He had spent 30 years developing database systems for Earth's largest corporations. When he saw the Council's data infrastructure, he nearly cried. It was worse than anything he had ever imagined. There was no indexing. There was no cross-referencing. There was no standardized metadata. Each database was an island, isolated and alone. Michael's team began with something radical. They talked to the users. They interviewed researchers from every species who had struggled with the data problem. They asked what people needed. They asked what was not working. They asked what an ideal system would look like. No one had ever done this before. Previous attempts at standardization had been designed by committees of experts who assumed they knew best. Michael's team started with the people who actually used the system every day. The answers they received were illuminating. Researchers did not want to replace their species' traditional systems. They were comfortable with those systems. They understood them. What they wanted was a way to search across all systems at once. They wanted to know what information existed without having to check 300 separate databases. They wanted a universal translator for data. The human team got to work. They developed a protocol called the Universal Research Interface. It was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than forcing every species to adopt a new system, the protocol created a translation layer. Each species could continue using its own methods, but every database would include a small module that converted its information into a common format for searching and cross-referencing. The key innovation was the metadata standard. Michael's team created a universal way of describing information. It did not matter if the actual data was stored in crystalline matrices or neural networks or organic memory cells. As long as the metadata was standardized, the data could be found. It was like creating a universal library card catalog that worked for every library in the galaxy. The implementation took 3 years of writing code, 3 years of convincing skeptical species to adopt the new standard, 3 years of debugging and testing and refining. The human team worked constantly. They barely slept. They made mistakes and learned from them. They faced opposition from species who saw no need for change and won them over one by one. When the Universal Research Interface finally went live, the results were immediate and dramatic. That same query about silicon-based life forms that would have taken 6 months now took 12 seconds. Researchers could search the entire collected knowledge of 312 species with a single query. Duplicate research dropped by 80% in the first year. New discoveries accelerated as scientists could finally build on each other's work. The council was stunned. They had assumed the data problem was unsolvable. They had lived with it for 40,000 years, and now a species that had only achieved a few centuries ago had fixed it in less than a decade. It seemed impossible. It seemed like magic, but it was neither. It was simply a different way of thinking. The high scientist requested a meeting with Dr. Tors. She wanted to understand how the humans had accomplished what no one else could. Michael smiled and tried to explain. Humans had grown up in chaos. Their world was messy and complicated and filled with contradictions. They had learned to find patterns in chaos. They had learned to create order from disorder. They had learned that systems did not have to be perfect to be useful. The council species had spent thousands of years trying to create the perfect data system. They had failed because perfection was impossible. Michael's team had succeeded by accepting imperfection. The Universal Research Interface was not elegant by galactic standards. It was a pragmatic solution to a practical problem. It worked well enough. And in a galaxy of 312 different species, well enough was revolutionary. Ambassador received the Council's highest honor for her contribution to galactic civilization. Dr. Torres and his team were given permanent positions on Station Prime. Human information scientists became the most sought-after consultants in the galaxy. Every major research institution wanted humans to help organize their data. The species that had been dismissed as primitive was suddenly indispensable. But the most important change was harder to measure. For the first time in 40,000 years, the species of the galaxy could truly share knowledge. Research that had been locked in isolated databases was now accessible to everyone. Scientists from different species could collaborate in ways that had never been possible before. The pace of discovery accelerated. The boundaries between species began to break down. The humans had not contributed advanced technology. They had not provided faster ships or better weapons or more powerful computers. They had contributed something far more valuable. They had contributed a way of thinking, a willingness to accept imperfection, a talent for finding practical solutions to impossible problems, a gift for organizing chaos. 50 years after the Universal Research Interface was implemented, the Galactic Council conducted a survey of its most important technological advances. The human's data system ranked third, behind only faster than light travel and artificial gravity. A species that had joined the Council barely half a century ago had already changed it forever. Dr. Torres did not live to see the survey results. He had passed away peacefully on Earth, surrounded by his family. But his legacy lived on in every query that found its answer, every researcher who built on previous work, every discovery that might have been lost in the chaos of the old system. He had not set out to change the galaxy. He had simply seen a problem and tried to fix it. That was what humans did. That was what made them special. The universe was vast and complicated and filled with wonders beyond imagination. But sometimes the greatest wonder was not a star or a planet or an ancient alien artifact. Sometimes the greatest wonder was a species that looked at an impossible problem and said, "Yes, we can solve that." Sometimes the greatest wonder was a librarian with a dream of making information accessible to everyone. The humans had arrived in the galaxy with nothing but their strange minds and their stranger ideas. They had left it forever changed. And somewhere in the vast databases of the Galactic Council, properly indexed and cross-referenced and easily searchable, their story was recorded for all future generations to find.